Here we start chapter 19, which is the sexual reproduction and genetics. But of course, if you're going to talk about genetics, we have to a little bit talk about reproduction and meiosis too. But I'm going to prefer to talk more about meiosis and reproduction in case you have been missing something so far, although you have seen it so far several times. In case you are missing something, you're going to complete it here and you're going to make sure that there is nothing missing in your class. Okay, the first thing, reproduction. It means having children. It means making copies. So every organism in the world, every living thing in the world reproduces, has the capacity for reproduction, and that's why we call it life. This is the definition of life. Without reproduction capability, we don't call it life. And they could come together, these organic mixtures, organic mixture from the organic soup, which formed like 4 billion years ago, arrived today, came until today, just because they could reproduce themselves, and they did make copies of themselves. Okay. Although reproduction is having children and it's the valid thing for all the organisms, there are different means of reproduction, especially between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. It changes a lot. For a prokaryote, the only way of reproduction is mitosis, which is dividing into two. So this is the parent cell, which just elongates and divides into two. You can see it here in the middle. So it's going to have two daughters. Okay, this daughter and parent, they have nothing to do with the gender. The prokaryotes, they do not have genders. It's just a nomenclature, it's just a terminology. We call them daughter cells. And how it happens is that the prokaryotes, they usually have one single and circular chromosome. It is first replicated, so it is copied by, the DNA pol enzyme. And then the cell enlarges and elongates in two directions and then divides into two. Of course, they don't have a real cytoskeleton. Some other more simpler proteins help them in this process. And then it divides into two, creates these daughter cells. And guess what? These daughter cells are identical. So which are clones. Also, they are identical with the parent. So in a way, the parent cell duplicated and made two copies of itself. So unless there is a mutation, there is no genetic diversity. Okay, and here I assume that there is no plasmid exchange taking place or something. So it's only the main chromosome of the bacterium. In this case, it just creates clones without any genetic diversity. When it came to eukaryotes, they do have genetic diversity. So only by this reproduction, they can increase the genetic diversity. That's the main difference. But it doesn't mean that all eukaryotic organisms reproduce by sexual reproduction. So that would be a misconception. Reproduction can happen in an asexual way or in a sexual way in the eukaryotic organisms. Here we are looking at plants. This plant, for example, can grow a shoot so that it's going to start a whole new organism here. This organism is identical with the parent, it's just younger. And they are genetic copies. And yes, it can shoot once again to create a new one. There are many plants growing this way. This is a very effective way of growing, except that it doesn't create any genetic diversity. Or imagine that you sow some plants at your friend's home. You can get a piece, maybe just a leaf, and then put it in a glass so that it's going to start to grow the roots, and then put in the soil, and here the new plant grows. This is a way of asexual reproduction. Only one parent is giving rise to the children. But they can also reproduce sexually, which is flowering. These flowers, they look nice. I really hope that you see some flowers around your home in this quarantine. All I see is the wall of the other building. So they smell nice, they look nice, but what we are actually looking at is the genitals of the plant. So whenever you smell a flower, you're actually smelling the genitals of the plant. Here you usually see both males and the female organs. So although the plants can reproduce sexually, the sperms and eggs can actually come from the same organism too. So maybe this plant creates both eggs and sperms, and then they are going to fertilize. Even that increases genetic diversity. Or maybe it is going to, if there are any bees around, bees are extremely important in this process. Once the bees are gone, we are also gone. That's the end of humanity. So if there are bees around, maybe they are going to cross-fertilize it with another tree so that they are going to have even more genetic diversity. So in the case of animals, again, they can produce asexually and sexually. So here, for example, this worm is just dividing into two, so it's just making copies of itself. This is an asexual reproduction. Or this hydra is making a branch. This branch is going to leave and create a new hydra. So this is going to create a new organism just by budding. Some of them can reproduce by parthenogenesis. Sometimes, not every animal can do that. It's more common in insects like bees. It's less common in vertebrates like these lizards. In the bees, for example, the queen bee, it can have fertilized eggs. Sometimes it mates and the eggs are fertilized. Sometimes it doesn't mate and the eggs are unfertilized. These unfertilized eggs, through parthenogenesis, they can create the male progeny. Of course, the queen bee is diploid. Oh, sorry. This doesn't work. This queen bee is diploid. And when it goes under meiosis, the egg is haploid. And when the unfertilized egg grows, the male progeny also becomes haploid. So all the male bees that you see, they are actually haploid. And they come to life by parthenogenesis. Or if they are fertilized, they become haploid again, so they become females. And one of them will become the queen. Or if you talk about the lizards, it's going to happen in a different way. They create the copies of their mother, but that's a different story. Okay, so even though they are multicellular, even though they are animals, even though they have the capacity to sexually reproduce, like in here, sometimes they just reproduce asexually. Happens, no problem. Okay. It depends on the conditions. And sexual reproduction is very common. It is not the dominant way of reproduction, but it is quite common both in the plants and in the animals. The logic of sexual reproduction is that the two cells come from sometimes the same, sometimes different organisms, but there are two germ cells. One is egg. We call the big one as egg. This contains the DNA, of course, and then the nutrients, etc. It's usually not motile, it's stationary. And there is the sperm, again haploid. This is usually mobile. So the sperm of the male is moving long distances usually to arrive at the female or arrive at the egg. And then these two unite, what we call fertilization, so that diploidy is restored, and then this organism is going to develop. So that's the same logic everywhere in the sexual reproduction. In some animals, like the birds, the fertilization takes place inside the body, but then this egg, which is actually an embryo, grows out of the body. In some other organisms, like the mammals, the fertilization is going to take place here inside the uterus. The egg is here, it is going to move to the fallopian tubes here. The sperm is going to come to here and they meet here with the sperm. The fertilization take place here, and then it's going to grow in the uterus. This is how it happens in the males. In the mammals. So it can grow outside the body, inside the body, but all in all, it starts to go under mitosis and develop into a mature body. So you can see that we are eating many of these embryos. So these eggs, maybe you're eating every day in the breakfast. They are very good for your health, unless you're vegan, because they are highly rich in many nutrients, proteins, fats, carbs, okay, many minerals. They are very rich because this egg is going to take care of the embryo who is going to grow in them. So the embryo will start to eat this egg nutrients and then it will grow. This is why it is healthy to eat eggs. This is why they are so rich. And in the case of plants, this is how it looks like. This is the female organ. These are the male organs. They also fertilize, and here you are looking at the embryos of the plant. So we commonly eat these embryos. Again, they are very rich in protein, lipids, and carbs because they are going to keep the embryo alive until it can start to produce its own food. Here, it doesn't produce its own food. In the case of chicken, it eats once it hatches, it eats the other organisms. But here, it can do photosynthesis and produce its own food, but not as embryo. First, it has to grow and then make some leaves, and then these leaves are going to do photosynthesis, and then it will produce food. Until then, all these nutrients here in this embryo will keep the embryo alive until it develops. Okay, this is why we are eating the seeds, which are the embryos of the plants, quite a lot. It's very common and they are very healthy. Okay, in the sexual reproduction, we have seen that there are two cells, and I said that these two cells can come from the same organism or can come different organisms. So in many cases, there's a father and there's a mother. There are two individuals. They both have meiosis. And then they both have gametes, which is the sperm here, egg here. They are anyway different from each other, God forbid, if they are siblings. And then they are going to have a diploid embryo. This is how it happens. But in some cases, there are hermaphrodites. This is a study of hermaphrodite. It looks both female and male. Of course, in mammals, we don't see this hermaphrodites, but in insects, in plants, it is very common. Both the, check here, this is the female organ, both the egg and the sperm, they originate from the same organism. And even then, it increases the genetic diversity. So here in this case, there is the individual going on meiosis. After this, it creates eggs and it creates sperms, and then finally they will meet to make a new embryo. Okay, obviously, mitosis or asexual reproduction doesn't increase genetic diversity. This is obvious. Okay, and we know that the sexual reproduction increases genetic diversity. What about this in the middle? Okay, I mean, here there are two different individuals anyway. Maybe one is black, one is white, or one is tall, one is short, one has blood type AB, one has blood type 0. So they're different from each other. Of course, their combination will be unique. It increases the genetic diversity. But what about this? If the both egg and sperm come from the same individual, do you think it's going to increase genetic diversity? So many students think no, but the answer is yes, it increased genetic diversity because when the meiosis is happening, yes, they are the same alleles, but the same alleles are reshuffled. So maybe it was heterozygous for an allele here, but finally it is going to end up homozygous, or maybe it's going to end up homozygous of this. So just the same alleles will be used in a different combination, and because of that, this is going to increase genetic diversity. So the highest genetic diversity is obtained by sexual reproduction. A little bit of genetic diversity is obtained by sexual reproduction, where the gametes originate from the same organism, can be plant, can be animal, and no genetic diversity is obtained in asexual reproduction unless there is a mutation.